At RMIT, we would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners on the land on which the university stands. We respectfully acknowledge elders past, present and future. Today we have Dr. David Kelly as our presenter. David is a geographer and ethnographer specialising in the expansion, intensification and lived experience of precarious dwelling. He's collaborated with First Nation people, people with disability, public and community housing tenants, homeless households and communities affected by urban renewal. The scholarship specifically attends to the social and spatial life of policy and how it shapes housing adequacy, security and justice. Welcome, David.
Thank you. All right, I'll share my screen and then everyone can see that. We good?
That's great. Thank you, David. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me, Nigel, and thanks CUR staff for coming. So I'm also coming from the lands of the people of the Woiwurrung and Bunurong language groups, and all of my research here and my livelihood is in constant relation to the fact of dispossession and ongoing sovereignty. So I just want to acknowledge that speaking about public housing, public infrastructure, and those sorts of issues are always contaminated by the very fact of dispossession and theft. So I'm David Kelly. I'm a recent Vice Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow, just started a few months back. And this presentation is basically setting up the rationale for what I'm looking at doing for the next 3 years. And it's based on a lot of work that I've already done over the last few years around displacement, around renewal and inadequacy. And just to note that all of the images that are used here are either taken by myself or by research participants. So there's no copyright issue there, and each of them relates to either the site or the theme that I'll be talking about. So the kind of core issue here is that being stuck and then being forced to move, whilst materially different, are intimately related. So research to date has currently focused on trying to prevent displacement, at least the critical research, and to understand what happens to people along their displacement pathway and to the places that expel and host them. So what I want to understand is what happens to the people who are forced to move, people who would rather stay put. But more recently, what I've been asking is what happens to people who are forced to stay, people who would rather move. So to begin, there's this huge body of gentrification research and gentrification research that looks at displacement. And what it looks at is the implicit notion in gentrification that people move from place. And it looks at demographic shifts at a population scale fundamentally. So these are the particular categories of race, ethnicity, age, family composition, occupation, and education, how they change spatially over time, and how that's a good indicator for gentrification occurring. We also look at rising or inflated property values, and how lower income populations tend to cash in on rising property values, selling their home to higher income populations and moving on. And then we see more cultural analyses of how civic, retail and hospitality spaces change to cater for the taste of gentrifiers. Things such as popular tropes like artisanal bread, craft beer, barbershops, brunch spots, they're all very popular cultural analyses for gentrification. And then we have this body of research that looks at the rise in rate-paying bases via subdivision and density-driven redevelopment, which results in more funding for the revitalization of green space and community spaces such as libraries. Also, what we focus on is the impact for people who are displaced from gentrifying areas when they'd rather stay. So private sector renters here are a large group who are vulnerable to rent increases due to local market uplift and or via the sale of rental properties due to speculation. And this applies to social housing communities globally as well, who are becoming more vulnerable to market forces driving their displacement from well-located sites and well-established social networks. Now, from this research comes a strong understanding that there are compounding negative health and well-being impacts for people that experience forced moves. A Hurry in 2020 released a report demonstrating that financial hardship, mental health, forced moves, and homelessness are intimately related and biodirectional. So with forced moves comes a significant likelihood of mental distress and financial hardship, which significantly increases the likelihood of homelessness. And these impacts have knock-on effects. So they affect health, welfare, infrastructure policy portfolios, just to name a few. And gentrification not only causes displacement, but the cost of that displacement is shared not only by those experiencing it, but it's also shared publicly and socially. Such has been the weight of this research evidence that demonstrates the deleterious nature of displacement, that critical urban research has sought to find scenarios where the improvement of low-income spaces can be achieved without displacing residents. And this aligns with very influential work from Australian geographers such as Ruth Fincher and Kurt Iveson, which identifies the advantages of low-income households located in wealthier neighbourhoods, and not via social pressure, but by increased access to well-serviced community infrastructure, transport, and social services. So there's a locational advantage to simply being poor in a rich area. But more broadly speaking, mainstream urban research and dominant trends in public policy development either implicitly or explicitly celebrate gentrification. So critical scholars such as Louis Bacon and Tom Slater contend that urban research since the early 2000s has shifted from denouncing the process of gentrification to actively advocating for it. And we see this in the fiercely contested study area of social mix, where the mainstream view holds that the introduction of higher income groups to disadvantaged geographies improves a range of outcomes for lower income groups in the area. And so this, coupled with tenure blind approaches, which is the kind of the hiding of tenure through design, these tenure blind approaches to urban renewal are the policy of the day, and they're implemented in almost every post-welfare major city globally. And so for Louis Bacon, tenure blind constitutes an effort to invisibilize working class and ethnic communities in the inner city. Now, beyond gentrification research, emerging critical urban research is beginning to identify a range of conditions that render people and communities vulnerable to displacement. So speaking from a southeastern perspective as opposed to a northwestern, Aaron Yiftchel argues that displacement doesn't seem to capture the growing dwelling uncertainty of contemporary cities. And he states that displaceability as a concept expands our understanding of displacement from a policy act to a systemic condition through which spatial power is exerted by policy, legalities, and violence. So displaceability holds large parts of urban society in suspense, often living on borrowed time in conditions of growing vulnerability and uncertainty. And this understanding of displaceability and precarity resonates strongly with other housing scholars such as Michele Lancione, who argues that housing precarity is coming to define the future of urban existence. And also theorists such as Lauren Ballant, who says that liberal economies as specific spaces and times are characterized by the endurance and expansion of the precariat class. And these understandings are not just theoretical or academic. So for some time now, community-based and community-driven research collectives have been producing open source resources that highlight these precarious forces. So take, for example, the Urban Displacement Project, which has produced a model of displaceability, mapping risks of eviction, forced moves, and poverty in major North American cities. And whilst the producers of this data are academic, the material is produced for grassroots groups to utilize in anti-displacement campaigns. And then there's the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is an activist art and research collective that tracks evictions in gentrifying areas of San Francisco, LA, and New York. And this group differs somewhat given their explicit focus using data and stories to produce and build social movements locally and globally. And these campaigns tend to highlight both the racialized and the gendered nature of displacement and are predominantly led by people of color and women. Then there's a more narrowly focused project on London Estate Watch. So this maps the demolition, the sale, and proposed renewal of council housing estates in London. And so public housing has always been considered one of, if not the safest tenures in places such as the UK and Australia. And what this map does is highlight the very intensity of precarity felt in low-income housing infrastructures at the present. And what we're witnessing through this visualization is a concerted unmooring of marginalised urban dwellers. And this is what I would call a global unmooring. We see this in places such as Melbourne, where we have the Say Public Housing Collective, of which I'm a member, which has copied this format to highlight the scale of renewal and displacement in Melbourne's already gentrified areas. So these are areas that are regarded as safe, where people have locational advantage, but are becoming increasingly precarious. So as you can see, there's a strong academic and community interest in displacement and dwelling precarity. And these include a focus on both private renters, racialized spaces, and public housing communities. Now, all the while, these concerns are finding ways to communicate the scale of precarity and the growing risk of displacement. Public policy, which is supported by mainstream urban research, is catalyzing new gentrification frontiers via estate renewal programs. And these renewal programs all involve the displacement communities. Despite there being costed and viable alternatives to renovate and repair dwellings to a higher standard and at a lower cost than renewal, alternatives that don't involve relocation. So whether or not mainstream urban research or public policy agrees with these assessments, there can be no refuting that renewal produces a geographically intense precarity at sites that were thought to be the safest tenure. So why is precarity produced through these renewal programs? Well, I think that begs quite an intuitive response. So Neil Smith, urban researcher, quite prolific, identified the rent gap theory in the late 70s, which describes the difference between current rental income and potential rental income of neighborhoods. So the idea is that the bigger the rent gap, the more viable the case is for private investment to realize fictitious future rents. So along with my colleague and your colleague, Libby Porter, we analysed the current public housing renewal program here in Victoria. And what we found buried amongst the detail of a commercial review in inner city public housing estates was an explicit recommendation for a real estate model of renewal. So estates that yielded the maximum commercial return for private developers were recommended for renewal. And the Victorian government explicitly adopted this real estate model, and it's in all of their policy documents to do with the renewal, which is effectively the rent gap theory in practice. But not all estates have the same potential windfall, and one way to maximize the commercial viability of renewal is to manage a decline in the dwelling standard of estates. So we can observe this decline by examining the maintenance expenditure of Victorian government, which spends the least of any other Australian state and about half that of New South Wales. So there's broad consensus that the material dwelling conditions in low-income housing infrastructure has been in decline for some time now. There's an inadequacy that we haven't yet fully comprehended, but we know it exists. In many situations, when the rent gap is big, this attracts renewal, and displacement inevitably happens in these scenarios. But not all declining infrastructures attract renewal, at least not at first. And while the material conditions deteriorate because of a more pervasive housing crisis, there are limited options available to households to improve their situation. Households are quite literally stuck in this decline, awaiting whether they're awaiting renewal or just simply repair and maintenance. And we can see this in popular discourse, where we witness speculative investors attempting to get ahead of the gentrification wave, only for it not to come. And this was apparent in Australia's mining boom, where we had aspiring property investors flooding small towns, when we had big infrastructure development planned, or in the anti-dereliction movements of, say, Italy or Ireland, where community groups are mobilizing to reclaim derelict buildings that investors have hoarded whilst awaiting value uplift. But sometimes that wave never comes, and sometimes that investment never comes. So in these scenarios where decline is happening and inadequacy is apparent, what's happening? And the answer is we don't really know, although intuitively we might. In terms of research, we don't know. Whilst Australia is a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of which the right to adequate housing is a part, we don't monitor the adequacy of our housing stock. As such, we have a very poor understanding in policy and research of how people live with and adjust to inadequacy, what the scale of inadequacy is, how this costs the society economically, and what policies maintain the production of that inadequacy. But we do have some indicators of how ripe this actually is, and they can be found in those low-income housing infrastructures. I'm sure you might recall the lockdown of Flemington and North Melbourne public housing estates during the first wave of COVID here in Melbourne. And what became apparent here was that the material dwelling conditions of these estates had a direct impact on the health of residents, and the exposure to precarity provided a discursive pretext for a violent and heavy-handed police response. Now, the Victorian Ombudsman termed the event, the police response, as a human rights abuse. And in response to that fallout, the government created the voluntary tower relocation program to resettle overcrowded and vulnerable households. And there were 420 spots available, 260 households applied, but only 120 were approved. Now, among those who were rejected was a participant in some of my previous research, and this person applied for transfer, for priority transfer, on at least 4 occasions, each with supporting letters from family doctors urging an immediate transfer to a more adequate dwelling. Each time they applied, they were rejected, and on the Tower Housing Relocation Program, they were rejected again. In his house, there are 5 people in a 2-bedroom dwelling. His daughter has missed 50 days of school in 2 years due to respiratory illness related to poor ventilation and allergic reactions to aging carpet. And he and his daughter have been attacked with a knife in the laundry room by a man squatting there. Despite this, he was rejected for the Tower Relocation Program and given no explanation other than does not meet eligibility criteria. So why are unsheltered folk squatting in public housing estate laundries? Well, because crisis accommodation can be even more hazardous. Purchased accommodation for people experiencing homelessness is provided in Victoria via the Housing Establishment Fund, which is a funding stream intended to resolve homelessness via Housing First response. So Housing First is unconditional access to ongoing housing. The funding is so inadequate that it's frequently used to house people for only 1 or 2 nights. And the accommodation in many circumstances is so bad that this year the North and West Homelessness Services Networks are including in their client survey the question, is any bed better than no bed? In 2019, the service networks instigated a boycott of the worst crisis accommodation in Melbourne, effectively prohibiting referrals to them. The government has long acknowledged that this is an issue and has funded the Crisis Accommodation Options Project, as well as various inquiries into rooming houses. But such is the scarcity of options that are available for fund and the funding that currently exists used to purchase accommodation, that there are many rogue and slum landlords still in existence and receiving referrals. So some of you may have heard of the Coburg Motor Inn, where Nick Cave's son was found deceased recently. 1 week after that event, another man was also found dead at the inn. The Coburg Motor Inn predominantly houses men recently released from prison and single men referred to by the service networks. It's long been earmarked for boycott given its inadequacy, but there are so few options that a boycott has been unfeasible so far. So in summary, there are community, activist, research and policy expressions of inadequacy, and there's broad scale acknowledgement that this exists. However, despite this acknowledgement, there's been no effective or compelling public policy response. All the while, there hasn't been any policy response. Precarity and inadequacy is growing at a much faster rate than the supply of affordable and adequate housing and the maintenance of our current low-income housing infrastructure. So what should critical housing and urban research be asking about inadequacy in our dwelling infrastructures? So for the next 3 years, I'll be working on this issue, performing an ethnography to ask these fundamental questions about being stuck in inadequacy. I'll be examining how experiencing critical inadequate dwelling scenarios endure. And so this endurance question may have significant ramifications for how we respond to housing precarity. So if you recall the case of the public housing lockdown, the government response to housing inadequacy and housing precarity was to violate human rights. As the precariat grows, as we've identified it growing, we need to understand what actions people take are simply done as a matter of survival within deeply unequal social relations. What I also aim to begin to understand is the sheer scale of housing inadequacy, especially in low-income housing infrastructures, and what its pervasiveness might tell us about its relation to other urban infrastructures. So the rationale here is that dwelling is a relational way of being, and so the cost of precarious dwelling is shared across social systems. Therefore, a whole of society response is required. And finally, what are the policy instruments and technologies that are sustaining the growth and presence of precarity, inadequacy, and stuckness, and how can these be shifted? That is all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. That was fantastic, really eye-opening and really, really important research. There's a question from Annette. Would you like to turn your camera on and or would you like to just ask the question in it, or just?
Yeah, happy to ask the question. I can also turn the camera on.
Thanks so much.
But I'm not looking into the camera. David, first of all, thanks for that talk. It was really, really interesting. And yeah, as Nigel said, really important. I actually had a question quite early on, and that was about the tenure blind thing that you mentioned. And I'm just not entirely sure about the notion of tenure. So I was wondering, does that refer to social housing or really, well, just renting versus owning? So yeah, just wondering about that.
Yeah, it's almost exclusively applied to public housing or social housing renewal, whereby a 100% concentration of social housing is mixed with private tenures. So that can be ownership or rental. But the idea is that in that mix, in the redesign of that estate, you cannot tell by looking at either dwelling whether or not it's of a particular tenure type.
Okay.
So a design principle to prevent the immediate identification of tenure.
Yep, great, thanks.
Thanks, Annette. Thanks, David. Does anyone else want to ask a question or make a comment? David, if you'd like to also, we spoke earlier, but maybe just reflect a bit on your research methods. Would that be something you'd be happy to do?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so yeah, Nigel and I were talking about what is ethnography. So maybe not everyone is familiar with that as a methodology, but it's something that I've done since PhD. And it's my methods for this project is going to be basically shadowing caseworkers over a 2-year period working in their day-to-day roles to identify when they encounter intensely precarious or intensely inadequate housing situations for people in crisis accommodation. So that involves pretty much seconding myself to the activities of the participants and working with them in their everyday life, through their everyday practices over an extended period of time, and taking a more kind of long durée of data points rather than just one singular interview. So it will be repeated conversations, repeated interviews over a long period of time with a small cohort of people to understand depth and breadth of an issue rather than just single point in time analysis. That's not how everyone would describe ethnography, but generally it's, it's a research method for living and experiencing with participants the sorts of things they go through.
Thanks so much, David. I'm just going to stop the recording. I should have done that earlier. I apologise. But there are more questions coming in. Just want to thank you again for your terrific presentation.